I want to thank Greg Clark with the Indianapolis Bond Bank for being our title sponsor today. I want to thank Crowe Horwath and Barnes & Thornburg and the Indiana Commercial Real Estate Board of Realtors, Regis, Purpose Built Investments, and we particularly want to thank Krieg DeVault and Dave Corbett for being our host today and providing this great venue. So if we can give our sponsors a big hand, we appreciate it. Angie, if you want to get started, and then when it gets down to David, we'll start our panel discussion. Thanks, you guys. Excuse me.
Good morning. My name is Angie Stino. I'm with Crowe Horwath. We are a CPA consulting firm. I work here out of our downtown Indy office. I am in our government services group. My role is primarily working with local units of government in the issuance of debt. I help them structure the debt, identify revenues, align those revenue streams to debt service payments. We do a lot of economic development activity as well, from helping put incentive packages together, abatements, review of contracts. Some of that work is handled here in Indy. Some of that work is out of our Chicago office. I would be remiss also if I didn't recognize one of my colleagues here today, Ridge Miller. Ridge's group is out of our Indy North office. And what Ridge's group also does is really in our audit assurance practice, working with project owners, developers, contractors, reviewing those contracts, doing change order, construction audits, and really seeing from that perspective, really representing the construction side and the real estate development side as well. Thank you so much for having us, and I will turn it over to Bruce.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Donaldson. I'm a partner with the law firm of Barnes & Thornburg here in Indianapolis. I've been a municipal bond lawyer since late 80s or so. Done various types of local public finance, but in the last several years have concentrated very heavily in redevelopment and economic development, usually representing municipalities, doing a lot of TIF bonds, in particular, a lot of developer-related TIF bonds, and in some respects, I've also represented developers on the other side of the table, on some transactions in negotiating incentives with the governmental sector for public-private type projects.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Clark. I am the Executive Director of the Indianapolis Bond Bank. For those of you who don't know what the Indianapolis Bond Bank is, we are the debt issuing arm for all of Indianapolis and Marion County. So the qualified entities that issue through us include the city, the county, the airport, health and hospital. So that new Eskenazi Hospital was financed through the bond bank. Our main duties at the bond bank are really to help each of the qualified entities in issuing debt and also repaying it in a timely fashion in the way in which it's promised. So we're kind of that checks and balances system for each of the qualified entities. So it's good to be here, and thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Blake Blanche. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. IHCDA, as our acronym is, we cover basically everything having to do with housing in the state, whether it's homeless, Section 8 voucher administration throughout the state, energy assistance, affordable rental housing, single family, all that, as well as doing community development. So we cover the really broad gamut. My primary focus is on single family bond and market financing and multifamily bond financing.
Good morning. My name's Dave Corbett, and I'm happy to be your moderator here today. I'm a partner at Krieg DeVault. I concentrate my practice in the areas of government affairs, municipal finance, corporate finance, general corporate work, and some other strategic areas. I'm the department chair, I guess, of government services here at the firm, and happy to be here. So I did prepare a note card for each of the panelists to introduce them, but my crack staff of researchers dug up a lot of information, but they wouldn't let me share it here today. So we had to let everybody introduce themselves. So if you want to hear any more information about any of the panelists, please see me after the show. And I'd like this, as Connie indicated, this is more of a discussion. We are the panel sitting up in front of you. and this does remind me of law school where no one sits in the front, but we welcome your comments from the back of the room, from the middle of the room, and I'd prefer if you have a comment as a topic comes up that you're of interest to you, please feel free to raise your hand or let it be known that you want to ask a question, and I'll make sure I get to you. So let's start a little bit on the discussion. We're going to cover a few topics today. We plan to cover a few topics again. This is a discussion, so wherever we go would be fine. But just want to kind of start off with financing alternatives in the environment today. There's been changes since Bruce started financing in the 80s. There's been changes in the way that municipalities do their financing or commercial financing happen. So I just want to start by just talking about the alternatives. Looking at development of both public and infrastructure and privately sponsored infrastructure. What are the financing or investment alternatives available to a municipality, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Whomever.
I'll start. I think you've seen over the last several years, especially with the recession that hit in '08, private developers have had a hard time with breaking even on their investments in economic development. So they're looking to municipalities as a means of helping support and cover gaps within their financial models. So the most utilized of that is the tax abatements, and also you've seen TIF debt come up, which is tax increment financing. And Bruce is one of the subject matter experts in this area, and you're also starting to see, actually nationwide too, that TIFs get a lot of criticism because they're not always used in the manner in which I think that they were designed to be used. For those of you that don't know what a TIF district is, it's a designated boundaries of a geographical area that you've determined is in need of redevelopment or economic development. And the TIF revenues, which is the increment that is produced off of the increase in property taxes from the investment from the development, goes back to this TIF district, and you utilize those funds for future development and paying off the debt in which you secured to do the development. So I think that we're going to get in discussions too about the sort of the legislative update over at the State House, you're starting to see the state and other states really hone in on TIF districts and making sure, one, there's a mandatory sunset, that they don't exist in perpetuity. They have to come to a conclusion at some point. But I think that's been the most utilized tool in Indiana, at least in the past several years, is especially since property tax caps came in and the recession obviously hit. There's just not a lot of other tools available to local governments when you're trying to plug holes in your operating budget. There's just not a lot of tools. So it's one of the more utilized ways of financing.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in the environment we're in, as Greg said, as many of you know, as developers and people in real estate, there often are projects that you would love to do, but they're cost prohibitive for a number of reasons. You know, typically, particularly with downtown development type projects, the cost of land, the cost of structured parking, those types of elements can just make the numbers not work. Sometimes there are environmental issues, remediation issues. Sometimes it's just lack of needed infrastructure. But there's something that's prohibiting the private sector on its own from coming in and investing, and that's when the government decides to get involved and say, okay, here we're gonna come in and invest. On the other side of the coin, there's been a lot of pressure on governments not to hand out corporate welfare, be spending taxpayer money for things they don't need to. So it's very important for both sides of the table to focus on what we call the but-for test, which basically is saying, but for this investment of public money from the public sector, this project isn't going to happen. And I think it's important for the private sector to prove that to the public sector, and then it's important for the public sector to prove that to its taxpayers. And that's something that we really focus on. And frankly, that's something it's important to convince the legislature of, so that we can say, hey, we're doing projects that aren't going to happen in Indiana if we don't use these tools like TIF and so forth. We've got to make sure that that we're going to attract investment that otherwise wouldn't come.
And I think I would just add too, working with local units of government from the government side, we've really seen a change on how those TIF dollars are being used. I think traditionally you would see the government side really laying in the foundation for the roads, the utilities, the underground infrastructure. So really making land market ready, making an area available for businesses to come in, locate, and start that development. We've seen a change, I think, in the last is that we need to kind of go beyond that. And you're now seeing a more cooperation, I think, between private industry and local units of government, where some of those TIF dollars may be actually put towards an actual development project. So you're seeing that relationship, I think, change based on the needs of what type of project would benefit the area. There are loan agreements that now are entered into with the units of government and those private developers for certain projects. So I think you're seeing more conversation on what that need is. And it's not your traditional, when you think of government project, I think proceeds have changed somewhat in their use, and it's not the normal traditional government purpose where you're just putting in the sewer lines, you're putting in the roads. You're looking beyond that to see, are those TIF dollars, or it doesn't even have to be TIF, it could be income tax dollars that the town may have, or whatever the revenue streams are, to really change the way that assistance is coming forth and what that cooperation is looking like.
Great. Oh,
I'll
go
just
ahead.
add one other a question that I often get is, what are the alternatives to TIF? Because there has been a lot of scrutiny of TIF, and is it a good tool, or are there other things? And part of the problem, and Greg alluded to this, is that with property tax caps, there are just so many budget restraints on local units of government these days that they don't have a lot of options. And really, frankly, most of the time, the only realistic option to get new money for a project is to do a general obligation bond, where you have to levy an additional property tax on the taxpayers to pay it. And the problem with that is oftentimes you're subject to either a petition remonstrance or a referendum process. And you all know how the development world works. Somebody shows up and says, I need ABC to be able to do this project. Well, we'll get back to you in 6 months after we get through our petition remonstrance process and let you know whether we can help you or not. That's just not going to work. So the neat thing about something like TIF is that it allows the property taxes from the new development to essentially pay for what's needed to make that new development come.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that too. The way that the referendum on the general obligation bonds works is, anything over $12 million that the city wants to borrow has to go through a referendum. So you got to put it on the ballot. Well, that applies to my hometown of Jeffersonville, Indiana, the same as it applies to where I live now, Indianapolis, Indiana. So $12 million in the budget of $1.2 billion versus $12 million in a budget of $30 million are completely different. I think that was one of the things they missed when they put together these the property tax cap reform, was there should be a sliding scale for different sized cities. I understand the point of what they're wanting to do, which is if you're gonna put in a new levy, by all means, it needs to go to a taxpayer at some point. However, $12 million to a $1.2 billion budget is completely different, as we all know, to that of a smaller town or community that has to go through the same process. So again, I think that's one of the things that really we ought to focus on as an industry is if we're going to continue to clamp down on TIF and regulate and hinder the ability for municipalities to utilize that tool, we're going to have to loosen up somewhere else. And I think that's one way, especially for the larger communities, to really have the ability to issue more general obligation up to a certain point without having to go to a referendum, because no politicians or elected officials would take that on their first choice, would not to go to the ballot to do a particular project. So.
I was going to say, though, we have seen it successful with Eskenazi. So when that project was financed, it was through referendum. It was a lot of work. I think some of the team members, some of the firms on this panel were on that working group and had the opportunity to see that project through. So that was one of those successful examples where it could work. It was a very large-scale project. The behind the scenes on prepping for something that is very large itself. So just wanted to point that out for those that know that that project was funded going through the property tax referendum channel.
Excellent. I want to talk about the alternatives, but I want to just dive a little deeper into TIF just so the group here can understand. Are there any limitations to the use of TIF funds as we're looking at development, as we're looking at the ongoing operation of development? Just describe some of the limitations on the use and investment of TIF funds.
Yeah, I mean, the basic rule is that TIF can be used for capital type expenditures, but not for operating type expenditures. And but within the realm of capital expenditures, it's very flexible, so that it can be used not only for the types of infrastructure that Angie was referring to and so forth, but also for on-site costs. You can use TIF to pay for land. You can use TIF to pay for site prep. You can use TIF to even contribute to the cost of buildings and equipment on site. So it is a very flexible tool in that regard. But there was a recent Indiana Court of Appeals case that some of you may have heard of up in Munster, where the court specifically ruled that TIF may not be used for ongoing operation and maintenance costs related to a park, and that's caused a lot of discussion in the TIF world. And I've gotten to the point, because I get this question a lot, where I basically say, in some respects, it's now an accounting question. The legal test is it capital or is it an ordinary operating expense? And the accounting treatment almost dictates the legal answer.
And I think that's one of the biggest criticisms of TIF. He hit on the point of how you can spend those funds is when they are borderline used as the mayor or the executive body's slush fund. That's where people in the messaging of what TIF gets out, where you're paying operating or maintenance costs out of this TIF fund and not really using it for actual redevelopment. And that's where, again, the critics take another jab at TIF districts, because those funds can, the line of can I use it for this or can I use it for that is it's gray. And we're, just like Bruce said, we're still, even in the last year, getting guidance from our courts on exactly what is permissible and what's not.
So we've concluded you can use TIF for crack sealing roads, but you can't use TIF to fill potholes. For example.
I don't even have a response to that. That is true. Let's see. We're talking about the alternatives that municipalities use to invest in projects. What I want to be specific, though, about those alternatives and just give a little description of what those alternatives are, starting with the traditional financing through that, where a municipality might invest through a project agreement, loan agreement, onto P3s and TIFs. Can we just give a brief description so we have kind of a running list of the alternatives that may be available?
I think a lot of them manifest from TIF. I think you have, you either have a property tax revenue or you have some other type of revenue that you're going to utilize in order to pay back the debt in which you borrow. So, whether that is debt solely coming from the property owners or ratepayers, or if it's coming from perhaps the developer. In some instances, the developer has some skin in the game as far as it applies to repaying the debt. So, income taxes, I think that the P3 model has caught on a lot. By the way, there's a great article in the GFOA our monthly update that our own Indiana Finance Authority Director, Capital Finance Director Dan Hughey was an author on in this month's update that everybody should check out, because it really outlines what the pros and the cons of P3. And I think the jury's still out on P3. It's not a traditional means of financing. A P3, for all of you aren't familiar with it, is really where the government entity says, hey, developer, we want you to build this, but you're also going to have to finance it on your own as well, which brings into, there's probably going to be higher borrowing costs of the funds, because a private developer is not going to get the rating in which the government entity would. So does that in turn raise the costs of the project that you wouldn't otherwise see if you did the traditional financing model through the government bonding? And then also ensuring that the developer is making those payments, because there's probably a backup or a backstop in there that the government would step in the event that they don't make the payments. So again, I think the jury's still out on P3s. They've been utilized mostly in transportation, but you're starting to see them pop up in infrastructure and being proposed in infrastructure type projects. The big one is the toll road up in northern Indiana, and also the Indiana side of the new bridge project down in southern Indiana is a P3. So those will be two important pieces that affect our state that I think we'll definitely want to look out for and see how successful they are in the long run.
I was just going to add, for traditional financing, I think you tend to think of municipal governmental units issuing bonds at taxes and freight, primarily over a 20-year period, with the option to call those or redeem those bonds in 10 years. The government unit issues the bonds, the proceeds come in to that government unit, they then go out and invest those funds in public projects. That's what I tend to think of when you think of traditional. And that's what you've seen. A lot of times that may be, as I stated earlier, some of the beginning infrastructure that might be needed to spur private development, but that's what I see as traditional. Really, everything is really handled by the local units, and you're looking at that sense, and the developer really doesn't become involved, except for there is now infrastructure in some location that it makes sense for them to go and develop. Then I think you get into the next step that is outside of traditional. And traditional can be funded however. It can be the tax rate, it can be TIF, it can be your income taxes, really whatever revenue stream you pledge to make those payments. And that's what I would deem as traditional financing in kind of our world, is what I would look at that. And then I think you start getting into the next step, where the local unit of government is still out issuing debt. However, now there's actually private development that's been identified. And let's say, it's a mixed-use development, it's in a downtown area. There are needs now. The infrastructure's there. That's all great. The problem now is there's gap financing from the development side. And now those funds really need to go into the project itself. That's when I tend to we go to the next step. And there's a project agreement that's then issued, and then additional relationship and covenants between the developer and the local unit of government that they will continue. But then government funds still go towards a portion of the project, with the other fund coming from the private development side. I know Indianapolis had a number of those. I don't know, Greg, if you want to hit on any examples or any of the projects downtown where we've actually had a project agreement that has come up. Cityway was a good example. There's a lot of those we worked on the last 8 years that really, I think, improving downtown area. But I think that's the second step. So I don't know, Greg, if you want to provide any example of work you've done on Indy or the bond bank has done.
I mean, I think Cityway is a good example. I think also with the Mass Ave development, the Market Square Arena development that's being built now, those are all TIF-backed by our Consolidated Downtown TIF, which is the major economic driver for the city of Indianapolis. It produces the most increment and also has the most encumbering it as well. But Circle Center Mall was the original anchor of the Consolidated Downtown TIF. So it goes back to Mayor Hudnut, and they started that, and it's blossomed into a very strong economic driver to continue the development of the JW Marriott, of the Cummins project that's happening on the south lot of the Market Square site. So, those are all projects that went through the traditional project agreements where we as the city and the bond bank negotiated those with the developers. And if there's anybody in here that's on the executive side of government, if I can offer one piece of advice, is to have your finance people in the room when you're negotiating these deals, because there's a way to do this and there's a way not to do it. And the way to do it is once you signed it, it's harder to take it back and go back than it is to have it done and proactively trying to put a proper financial model into the actual negotiation of the project agreement than it is to go back. So if there's anybody out here that is on that side, I would strongly encourage it. You won't regret it, I promise.
I would be remiss if I didn't add that you should have your lawyer in the room as well. Angie?
Yeah. I was just going to add, a lot of times when you get to that type of project, and now you're entering into a project agreement, and if there are funds, TIF funds, that the city is contributing towards a private development, you really have to make sure then that the benefit is to your community. So a lot of times you start seeing additional requirements. The local unit of government may require a number of jobs that are going to be filled by that developer over time that's going to be measured. There may be measurements on the actual income that property may generate. So once you get to that standpoint, and it's really becoming outside of your traditional tax-exempt debt into more of a tax-exempt debt, but also a project agreement, there are usually additional requirements and agreements and ongoing covenants that may need to be met. I don't know, Bruce, do you want to add?
Well, I was just going to say, with project agreements between the public sector and private sector, the rubber meets the road when it comes to allocation of risk, because every project is going to involve some measure of risk. As you know, you're going to undertake some new development, and somebody's going to have to bear the risk of that. The private sector has come to the public sector and said, there are gaps in funding, there are risks that we're unwilling to take, and the government sector is saying, yeah, we want this project to happen, but we also have to protect our taxpayers and so forth. And so, for example, in the area of TIF, typically what you're going to see is an agreement's going to be entered into before the project's even started. And so there's some risk of the project actually getting constructed. There's risk associated with how that project's going to get assessed and the actual property tax increment revenues that are going to be generated from that. When you look at the finance markets, people are generally not willing to loan money on and take the risk for those types of developments. So, and there's some bankers in here I see. They're generally going to say, look, we love this project, but we're not making a real estate loan here. We need to have somebody stand behind this in case the project doesn't get built, or the project doesn't get built on time, or for whatever reason your projections of what this tax increment is going to be falls short. And so that becomes like a critical negotiating piece. Is the developer or the private sector going to have to stand up and either back that risk up with their own guarantee or letter of credit or something, or are they going to have to buy the bonds to take the risk? Or is the public sector going to step up and say, hey, we'll put our credit behind it in some fashion, whether it be a property tax or income tax, or in Greg's case, the moral obligation of the city of Indianapolis. And it really comes down to, how bad does the government sector want this project? How much are they willing to step up and back these things up? But risk assessment, risk sharing is the big issue, and then you get into things like job commitments and all that, and you can get into clawbacks. Hey, if you don't perform, we're gonna take back some of this money. There are a lot of obviously devil in the details in these agreements, but the essential point is that everybody's arguing over risk sharing.
And there is no correlation between the fact that the first two rows are empty and we've had no questions, but normally the question askers are sitting up front. If anybody has a question, again, please feel free to get my attention. There you go.
I know the new administration just has been in office a couple of days, but the election cycle brought up a lot of the issues about spreading TIF projects into neighborhoods. I just wonder if anybody has a feeling for the new administration and sort of the evolution of TIF funding outside of the central business district.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think that it's definitely happening. I think you saw in the late Ballard years that they started expanding to West Washington Street TIF over near the old Central State Hospital. You're also seeing the Broad Ripple TIF kicked off its first project in 2015, which is the Coil project up on North College where the old Shell station was along the canal. You're going to see that TIF, I think, will really blossom well, and it's going to have a lot of options in the next several years. The problem with some of these TIFs that people don't realize is that if you over leverage these things getting out of the gate, you can't catch them back up quickly, because if you're over leveraging it and the projects don't assess for what you think they are, and then it's like a snowball effect, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got a TIF that you thought was going to be, gangbusters, that's barely covering enough increment to cover its debt service on the notes that you have outstanding. So you got to be really, really careful with these new infant TIFs and make sure that you're not over leveraging them out of the gate so that you give them a chance for their long-term success. What's the other one up in the neighborhood?
Avondale Meadows? Or?
Yeah, Avondale Meadows is another one that's going to have, and it'll be interesting. You're starting to see some work along 16th Street here in the old north side. It'll be interesting to see what the new administration wants to do with that. But I think that downtown, and I think probably as a matter of, not as a matter of I guess, it's not going to be an option for, once you hit the certain level that your coverage levels start to increase or decrease because of the amount of debt you have outstanding, you've got to let it catch up. So I think you're going to see more of the neighborhood in the outskirts of the traditional mile square kind of going out into the city. I think there's tremendous potential out there. And, I think the new administration will definitely be focusing on that.
One thing I'd add quickly is the North Midtown TIF that Greg referenced that's doing the Shell building project up in Broad Ripple is very large and actually extends even south of 38th Street. So there's a potential to do some projects that are closer to the inner city. And in fact, one of the projects that we were doing right out of the gate was the Tarkington Park there at around 38th and Illinois. Several $1 million of improvements to that. So I think Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the philosophy of that TIF was let's make it large enough that where areas that are a little more affluent, if you will, like Broad Ripple, where there's likely to be more development, can help pay for some development in these areas where it's a little harder to get it going.
Yeah, and I also think that the airport TIF is another one that the airport TIF has been paying the bonds from the old United Airlines facility, and those are going to roll off the next year and a half. And once those roll off, it frees up some capital that allows that increment to be utilized for future projects. So that's another one that they're going to have options to utilize and strategically plan what they want to do with that particular TIF.
And I was just going to add too, when you're creating a new TIF or when you're deciding what's the best location, you really have to think of what the purpose and what you want to get out of it. Because when you say the word community, I think a lot of us think of, I think of homes, neighborhoods, but also maybe a small commercial sector. And it's really important to think about when you're drawing those boundaries, if there are a lot of homes in the boundary, then it does provide some risk on the TIF as well, on depending how those homes are valued. The city does have a couple of housing TIFs. Those have been those that have struggled over the past. A lot of fluctuation in the assessed valuation of homes. So I think you have to be really careful as well as how you're drawing those boundaries and really understanding the purpose of what you want to get out of it. Is it a one project that's going to work, or is this a long-term plan where you can see multiple developments start occurring once someone kind of sets that seed?
Yeah, and it's also making sure you're monitoring what you're paying in interest rates, and if you can, we're still at extremely historical lows for interest rates. So, if you can take those out and refinance them and free up some of your increment that you're paying towards debt service and utilize it towards either pay as you go or increasing the amount that you borrow or you leverage towards projects, that's another thing. So constantly monitoring that as well is huge, and I think that, over the past 3 years, we've done a good job in taking advantage of the low interest rates that we've seen. We've refinanced everything that we could that wouldn't provide too much of a penalty if we did it. So the city of Indianapolis has no variable rate debt on its books now, zero. We're locked in, have everything fixed. So that's another thing, is providing some sense of security and also allows the city and its controllers, the Office of Finance and Management, the ability to forecast and plan with some sort of certainty, rather than having this variable rate debt on your books, which, if you can lock it in at the lower rate now, why not do it?
One thing I'll add is that TIF is not a magic bullet to redevelop a particular area of town. Just drawing a TIF district in and of itself doesn't do a thing if you don't actually attract somebody to come in there and invest. Now, being able to offer something from the TIF to get them to come do that is part of the point of it. But I think it has to also be thought of in the broader context of what do we need to make this area of town attractive. Maybe there's some public safety issues or things like that that need to be addressed as well. Because again, sometimes people think, oh, we'll just create a TIF district and then we'll be able to invest in that area of town. It doesn't work unless you also have an environment that'll get people to come and locate there.
And I'll conclude that discussion just by saying, if you look at the Ballard administration, the initial focus was on the urban core, and it progressed outwardly from there. And I think the natural progression is into the neighborhoods and other opportunities where there is development and ground to be developed. You will see, TIF has shown to be a very valuable tool to the municipality, and you'll see that tool utilized. I think in the next administration, you might see it utilized a little differently in certain respects, but it will still be utilized to focus investment and development in certain areas. So, speaking of interest rates, I think let's turn our direction, and I'm going to ask Blake a question. What is anticipated? Obviously, I think we all know the December changes, but I want to know what's anticipated in your industry in respect of interest rates, and how will that change the development opportunities there?
It's interesting because I've been doing this for almost 19 years, and you hear economists after a while keep saying, interest rates are going to go up, interest rates are going to go up. I think we've been hearing that the last 6 or 7 years, it seems like. If I had a penny every time I heard it, I wouldn't need to play the Powerball tonight. And we're still hearing it. You finally saw the Fed make a move in December. I got something from a bank yesterday projecting out Fed funds rates at the end of the year. They're showing a couple more increases. The funny thing is, economists are projecting the 10-year going up a bunch. This bank was showing the 10-year about the same as it is now, which yesterday, I believe it closed around at 211, which, as Greg said, we're at historical lows still. I don't know what's going to happen on that. What I know is happening in the single-family market, which is impacting the multifamily as well a bit, is when the Fed came in and started buying mortgage-backed securities in 2008, 2009, was actually buying more than was actually being produced. So they were actually pulling stuff out of accounts. People were literally selling because rates were crazy what you could sell at. So the Fed stopped doing that, about a year ago. But if you could imagine, you have that huge portfolio of securities that's just spinning off cash. I mean, it's like a tobacco company in the 80s, just spinning off money. Well, they're pumping it back, buying mortgage backs. So while they're not going out and saying we're actively buying a ton, they're reinvesting all that in mortgage-backed securities, which is still keeping rates low. So if you were to go on a Bloomberg and pull up the TBA screen, which is the way securities are done for mortgages, if you want to see like for a 60-day delivery, 30-day delivery, all that kind of stuff, you'd see crazy prices on mortgages. So that's the reason why you can walk into any bank in the state and basically get a 3% loan, because that bank's still going to make a 101, 102 on that mortgage. So that's helping really drive the mortgage market and really drive the single family market. We've had record production at IHCDA. Year over year, we've had like a 20, 25% increase. It's been really beneficial for us. On the multifamily side, there's been some concern if treasury rates go up, how that impacts our multifamily deals. Because multifamily is really our bond finance. Is the area I focus on. That's an area that used to be dead. until FHA rates, which are taxable, actually got below where you could actually issue tax-exempt bonds. Think about that. The tax exemption actually is a penalty. That's the case on private activity multifamily bonds. Go figure. So what people were doing, you go out, you issue 2-year short-term multifamily bonds, you back them by a 2-year treasury. So you pay maybe 70 basis points. That 2-year treasury is at like, I don't know, 25, let's say. As an investor, that's a great deal. Tax exempt, backed by a treasury, paid off by a treasury. So you're picking up 45, 50 basis points over going out and buying a treasury. And it's rated AAA. So the investor, the builder, the developer does that. And at the same time, they have an FHA takeout. And because FHA rates are so low, you have a 35 or 40-year mortgage locked around 3.5%, which is unheard of on a multifamily transaction. There's concerns that that might end up dying off if we start to see treasury rates go up a bunch. That has really spurred a lot of development that used to really wasn't happening because those deals, really they're larger deals, and they're deals that really do need to get done within Indianapolis downtown. Everybody know where the old Downtown Comics is, the Consolidated building? That is a huge redevelopment. TWG Development did that. That was funded with IHCDA bonds and an FHA takeout. 800 North Capitol, another old building, abandoned warehouse, beautiful, bonds and IHCDA. Keystone Towers, lovely building up at Fall Creek and Keystone area. Redevelopment of that, IHCDA bonds. Illinois Place, which is the old Winona, bonds and IHCDA. So those are deals that if we really start to see rates come up, they might not be feasible going forward. But we really like seeing those get done. We're hoping it doesn't have a huge impact, but we'll see.
Do we have, well, in light of the threat to rising interest rates, should we anticipate a change in the pace of deals getting done? Should we anticipate that threat affecting the way deals get done any during this time?
I think it's going to take. You're going to have to see some sort of real impact. You know, that's the thing. So the Fed raised interest rates in December, yet we're still, you know, and part of it's China, part of it's, you know, the new year, but we still haven't seen a big, you know, effect in the market yet. And, you know, I think before you're going to see it impact the pace of projects being done or proposed, I think we're going to have to see something tangible that you know this won't cover. If we can only borrow at this level, this is not going to make the numbers work out on the back end in order to make this project successful on the private side or the public side. So, again, I mean, I'm curious what you guys think, but I really just think it's going to take something where we start to see this project can't get done because of the interest rates before you're going to see us I think before you see people take their foot off the pedal.
I agree. I think we've seen a little bit of a rise in the short-term note, so the 1 year you're seeing increases there, and that makes sense. The long-term, just this last week, we're actually seeing lower yields 20 years out. So, and of course, that's where, when you're looking at a long-term debt, that's really where it matters most in your overall cost to borrow. So we're not really seeing a huge impact. There isn't necessarily, I think, a one-to-one correlation necessarily with what you're going to see on the bond side when you're actually getting your interest rate. Just the fact there's a lot of other components that go into that borrowing rate. So when folks are looking to actually purchase bonds, they're looking at a lot more, looking at credit quality. They're actually digging into a lot of other avenues and other things that are going on in the market to make that decision on what the interest cost may be to a certain project or a certain user. Short term, I think there is some impact there. We're seeing that we're getting ready to issue a 1 year note. We're seeing the yields much higher than what they were last year, so that impacts that. But on the long term, we're not seeing anything. We're actually seeing a reduction. So for that fact, if there are any governmental units in the room, it's still a great time to borrow. It's still a great time to lock in long-term debt. So.
Anything on the residential side? Do we have any impact that you're seeing? Obviously, we've been at record highs and a lot of new residential development. Anything that you see that's impacted in the pace of that development?
You know, I think people feel comfortable in their jobs now. That was one of the things we saw the early teens. We didn't see, at least from our side, we didn't see a lot of production. There was a lot of stuff being done, but it wasn't coming through us. And it seemed like there was still a lot of concern that people were like, you know, I'm comfortable being a renter because I'm concerned about my job. And we've even seen that bleed over the multifamily side, because you see multifamily occupancies at all-time highs. And when you see that, then at some point in time, rents on multifamily are going to get to the point where it makes sense to jump over to the single-family side. The thing to watch on single-family is watch how they're underwriting the loans. Obviously, when things were stupid, if you had a heartbeat, you could get a mortgage. Well, now you almost have to have a master's degree to get a mortgage. So it's almost, the pendulum's almost swung all the way around. So, you know, I think watch how the credit quality is being done. Like for us, we won't, I mean, this is our purpose. We won't underwrite, we won't do a loan lower than a 660 credit score. And that's not uncommon. I mean, most banks won't do that now. So you have a huge number of the population that just, they aren't eligible. And we would love to serve them, but when you look at the numbers, you have people at that level of credit score and below, that's where your defaults occur. That's where your foreclosures occur. That's where the issues come up. So that's really going to help the multifamily market, but it's going to be a barrier to the single family, that you're going to have that ceiling there. The credit scores are really going to drive things.
Comment from the crowd, Mr. Brown?
Thank you very much. I want to get this question in before we end it, and it's more of a, not so much of financing, but more on the economic development incentives of TIFs and other mechanisms that units have available. And I think most of you are aware that last year the City County Council introduced a proposal that would impose a 1% fee for art for any incentives given by the city of Indianapolis. It was passed by the council, then vetoed by the mayor, and his reasoning was it would stifle private development. And you all probably have been involved in many deals and just wondered, and maybe even some folks in the audience could share whether or not they truly believe that asking for a 1% donation to the arts based upon an incentive granted by a unit of government would actually truly kill development, or is this something that they're willing to do? For instance, would TWG not have done the development downtown because they had to donate 1% based upon the incentive they got? So any thoughts you could give on that would be appreciated.
I can answer my HCDA. They just would have asked us to reduce our fee. We charge a point, so they would have asked, hey, could you cut the fee?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think, you know, if that type of program is, you got to be careful to make sure that they're not getting it back, you know, through their project agreement or their financing agreement, so that it truly is, you know, installed and put in place, and for all practical purpose is achieving the ends in which the council wanted that to take place. I have a feeling that the developers would be trying to figure out a way to get that 1% back somewhere in the deal. So it's just, you know, would it stifle development? I don't know if I would go so far as to say it stifles it, but you got to be careful to make sure that you know, it's really not the public side through the gap financing that's going to subsidize the 1%.
But I think that's what would happen, because honestly, I mean, you know how everybody will get creative on a deal, and they're coming to the table with saying we've got a gap, and if you believe them that they have a gap and that you have to fill that gap, that 1% is going to be 1% off that, you know, that gap. And so, you know, a lot of what we see, and maybe that's okay. I mean, maybe if you want to fund things like the arts, a lot of what we're doing out there now is cutting deals with developers that you're not going to get 100% of the TIF. We'll give you 80% or 75%. 25% is either going to go to the taxing units or to the redevelopment commission. So you got some room in there to maybe make some adjustments. And if you want to fund things like that, say, okay, we'll give you a little bit more TIF, but in exchange, you got to make these kind of contributions.
Yeah, I think it's fair to recognize the risk that Bruce is alluding to or directing our attention to, that in the monies that they receive or in the budget, that's not a definite budget. There are still risks involved that the developer has involved in financing the project, that if sales don't go as they would like, either higher or lower, rent rates aren't met, then there is a risk that their budget is underwater somewhat. But if we move to a system where we have more of the 80/20s or more of a contemplation of what we're going to give back over the life of this TIF, as a mandate, such as 20% of whatever the revenue is, then there are funds that we can contribute back to the taxing district as well as contribute to other areas that are important to the city. So definitely a balancing act on both sides of that. But I wouldn't disagree that it would take thinking, if you believe the developer, on exactly how to strike that balance. Question that we have on legislative preview, we're almost to the end. As we go quickly, and we're going to open it up to questions since we've had so many, we're going to open it up after we kind of get through this session. So just want to say, are there anything from a legislative perspective that we believe the room should know, or that we would be concerned with from a municipality or otherwise, enabling us to complete development?
I've got two things. I think one is to continue watching what they do with TIFs. Over the last 3 sessions, they've definitely had it in its sights, and either through installing the mandatory sunsets or other types of restrictions. The other thing I think is the emphasis they're going to put on roads and infrastructure, and if that flows back down to the local level, or if that's going to happen primarily at the state level through NDOT. And if it'll be interesting to see if they tweak with the wheel tax and the excise tax with those types of initiatives, because the numbers that they're throwing around are big, and obviously after the bridge in Tippecanoe County failed and we had a closure of 65, we can't have a main artery to Chicago shut down for that long. So I think that the focus on streets, bridges, roads, infrastructure is well placed. It'll just be interesting to see if the state's going to let any of that flow back down to the local level so that the municipalities can implement any of those initiatives.
I'll just comment on TIF. There's been an annual assault on TIF at the General Assembly. It comes from what I think is largely positions of ignorance, frankly. There are a lot of misconceptions about TIF, how it works, how it impacts other taxing units, in particular schools. There are perceptions that you're just robbing money from schools and so forth. I have quite a few facts that counter that, and also just the way the law works to counter that. I've been pretty actively involved every year in the discussions over at the General Assembly on this topic. So far, any modifications they've made have not really hurt the effectiveness of the tool, but some of them that they have proposed would have really hurt the effectiveness of the tool. And we have to be very vigilant to stay on top of that. The intel, if you never know if it's accurate or not. But what I'm hearing this year is that in the short session, they're probably not going to do much with TIF. They may leave TIF alone. But when we get back into the long session next year, we're going to have to watch out for it. There are always bills though that get introduced that are just just crazy, and you just hope they never even make it to committee. If any of you are interested, I've actually prepared a little bullet of 6 or 7 common objections to TIF and some responses to them. So if there are those of you who may interact with legislators and so forth, feel free to contact me, and I can send those to you, because I've kind of handed those around to local economic development people and elected officials to help kind of educate, particularly our legislative branch.
With that, I think the prepared program is over. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Sure. Rocco.
Question for Blake. Do you think if rates do go up, say by a percentage point or more, you'll see more activity in single family borrowing?
That's a very good question. So the question is, if we see rates go up, will we see more activity in single-family financings? Which, to give a little bit of background on us, when I started way back when, we issued bonds and we put mortgage-backed securities behind them. So we basically did an internal securitization, and we earned a little bit of spread over time. So if our bonds cost 5%, we charge 6 1/8 on the mortgage, basically legal arbitrage, and we'd make a little bit of money over time. Well, when the Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities, that market got really crazy, and that model didn't really work. And so we've shifted to where we actually make mortgages, but we actually do some third-party hedging, and we actually sell those mortgages. So we securitize them and then we sell them. We don't actually issue any bonds. So we make more money, we make it up front, we don't make it over time. I think it's not going to be interest rates so that's the background color. I don't think it's the interest rates that's really going to drive it. I think it's going to be, where do we see TBA rates going? Do we see pricing come down and not have those wide spreads? Does the Fed get out of reinvesting those MBS proceeds? That's really is going to be what drives it. Interest rates could go up, but if the Fed's still sitting there buying mortgage backs, our model's not going to work. And that's really a big difference. At one point in time, our portfolio was about $1.2 billion. Now it's down to about $400 million. So that's how much we've let roll off, has been prepaid, and how we haven't been issuing bonds. So I know, Eric, I'd love to be issuing bonds too, but we need the model to work. So, and I know Phil was here too. Phil, we'd love to be issuing bonds, but.
Any other questions? Well, with that, I want to thank Angie, Bruce, Greg, and Blake, and also thank Real Estate People for bringing this together. Again, Krieg DeVault thanks you for your attendance, and happy to be the sponsor here of the location and venue. And again, appreciate everybody coming out. Thanks again.